Hi there. So it's just on the stroke of noon. I'm Mark Taylor, by the way, so welcome. But let's just wait a minute or so for any stragglers to join us. So let's kick off in about 60 seconds. Okay, so the number of participants entering the room I can see is now stabilized. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm sure most of you do, but if you don't, I'm Mark Taylor. I'm privileged to be the Dean of WashU Olin Business School. WashU Olin is really proud to bring you the Leadership Perspective series. And we think of these as illuminating discussions with a really stellar lineup of speakers from a variety of perspectives. And in just a moment, you'll get to hear from two very accomplished people, one a successful BSBA alum, and the other a successful MBA alum, who's also one of our outstanding Olin faculty members. And we think of ourselves at WashU Olin as a community of people dedicated to pursuing new ideas, right, to taking on new challenges. And events like this one today contributes meaningful thoughts to this, if you like, this agora, this marketplace of ideas, and bring you to that nexus, that gateway of ideas, innovation, and hopefully inspiration. So today's Leadership Perspective event addresses points which are very important here. In fact, it involves a couple of our pillars of excellence, right? These are areas that are key to the success of our graduates and all business leaders. We like to focus on them. So the discussion will cover entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial spirit, right? And that is, again, one of our pillars of excellence, something we foster in all of our students. In addition, we'll also hear about data-driven strategy, but data-driven, but nevertheless values-based strategy. And again, the values data-driven, but values-based, being analytic, but with a strong value system. It's something again that it's kind of in the DNA, or the hallmarks, mix my metaphors, in the DNA of our Olin graduates. And embodying those ideas of values-based, data-driven, entrepreneurial, it's an honor to have living embodiment of those values in some sense, and that's Andrew Rubin, who's with us today, the co-founder and CEO of Illumio. Andrew, together with our WashU Olin marketing and entrepreneurship professor, Michael Wall, will discuss how to manage data-driven strategy, but also delivering shareholder value, building and marketing a unique product, motivating employees through shifts in workplace expectations. And after Andrew and Michael conclude their fireside chat, their conversation, they stand ready to answer questions. So please send your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in that allotted time. Okay, well, you haven't come here to hear me. Let's get, without further ado, let's introduce today's speakers and guests. So first of all, let's welcome Andrew Rubin. And as a co-founder and CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Illumio, which is a hyper-growth, late-stage cybersecurity company, Andrew is responsible for the overall strategy and vision of Illumio. He has deep expertise in segmentation, network security, regulatory and compliance management, and he's a really frequent participant in panels, author of numerous articles, podcasts, for leading industry events and publications. Indeed, Goldman Sachs has named Andrew one of the 100 most intriguing entrepreneurs each year since 2015. as part of its Builders and Innovators program. And prior to Illumio, Andrew was president and head of worldwide field operations at Simtech, which is a leader in the intrusion detection market. I'm very, very proud to say that Andrew graduated from WashU Olin with a BSBA in finance. And while here at Olin, he was the first undergraduate student to win the Olin Cup, which is a business plan competition which is run through the Scandalaris Center for Entrepreneurial Studies. So welcome, Andrew. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Dean. Thanks for having me.
Now I'd like to also welcome Michael Ball, familiar to many of you. Michael is one of our wonderful faculty members. He's a professor of practice in marketing and entrepreneurship here at WashU Olin. He came to us from Chicago, where he worked as the vice president of digital strategy and solutions architecture for Rise Interactive, which is a leading digital marketing firm. And prior to his time at Rise, Michael helped to start two businesses, including Point Drive, which was acquired by LinkedIn, is now an application in their sales solutions portfolio. Michael continues to stay very closely linked, very closely tied to the industry as co-director of the Center for Analytics and Business Insights, CABI, here at WashU Olin. And he's also the academic director, excuse me, of the MBA marketing platform. So, Andrew, Michael, we're honored to have you with us today, and I'm sure our audience is really eager for you to start the discussion. So I'll hand things over to Michael to get us started. So, Michael, please take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dean Taylor. Thank you, Andrew, for being here, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for what I know will be a really insightful discussion around innovation, growth, leadership, and of course, data. And Andrew, I thought a good way to get us started would be a discussion that you and I had when we first met a little over a month ago now. And I'll call this talking point innovation through the lens of value. And a comment that you made to me during that discussion was that markets are oftentimes more important than ideas. And I was hoping that maybe you could elaborate a little bit for our audience what you meant by that idea and how others can take that mindset in helping them when exploring innovation opportunities or growing existing businesses.
Yeah, thanks for having me first. I hope next time we do this, if there is a next time, we're sitting next to each other as opposed to staring at monitors. And for all of you out there, it's good to see you. I'm gonna also note, I apologize that I'm caffeinating still. That's my coffee mug. It's still morning here in California, and I started a few hours ago, so you'll see me continue to do that. Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. When we talked about a month ago, as you said, Michael, one of the things that I know we touched on was this concept of sort of innovation, which tends to focus on the idea, in our case, the technology, but the sort of idea at the heart of starting a company. And then this other thing that, quite frankly, doesn't get talked about a whole lot, sometimes gets forgotten altogether, which is the market. And I think one of the things that I said at the time to you was, I'm amazed at how little people pay attention to the market conversation when they're so focused on the idea conversation. And the reason why, and starting Illumio really sort of, I'll say, taught me this, and now has reinforced it over the last 8 or so years, is that markets really are the foundational element of every single startup. And I know that may sound like a funny way to say it, but I'll use this really stretched and somewhat silly example to sort of enunciate the point. If you have a small group of people who are all brilliant, and they have what by definition is an incredible, interesting idea, and let's assume that their brilliance allows them to execute and take the idea from their head or on paper or on the whiteboard and turn it into reality. So you've solved for 3 of the hardest things, which are getting a great group of people together, having a really brilliant idea, and then having the ability to execute against it. Arguably the 3 most critical things. The thing that starting Illumio and building Illumio has taught me is actually you haven't solved for the one thing that ultimately drives all the success or failure if you get the other 3 right, which is how big a market is that idea going to live in? And to take my silly example and stretch it all the way out, if they build this beautiful, wonderful, amazing, incredible thing, but the total worldwide demand for it is $100 million US, that company is never going to be a large, sustainable, durable public company. because they'll get to 100 million and there'll be nowhere to go from there. And so one of the things that I know for me has been really important is constantly coming back to the notion of product market fit. That's the way most people talk about it. I remember learning about it that way in school. And we overemphasize the product side and either underemphasize or sometimes forget altogether to think about the market side. And I think starting with understanding the market, understanding the opportunity the market's presenting, where's the hole, how big is it? If you don't figure that part out, then getting the product right is irrelevant. And that innovation versus sort of market opportunity conversation, I think we have sort of an obligation to re-emphasize the market side of the conversation and make sure that we understand just how important that is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think your insight really helps us to think about how companies sometimes maybe get stuck with what's often referred to as tech push or product push, where you're really focused on features and benefits and not really focused on how that ties back to the business opportunity. And it's really interesting. I think that might be a good segue into, your organization and the cybersecurity space in general. Yeah. And what might be a good starting point is maybe just to help educate the audience on what Illumio does and how you kind of thought about that idea of markets and ideas and the relationship between the two. Would you mind maybe just sharing a little bit about the organization and how it fits into the problem that you identified when making the decision to start it?
Yeah, and I'm going to give you the punchline, which is I think we actually did a terrible job of that analysis that I just described, and sort of over time have gotten a little bit better and maybe spent more time on it now than we did in the beginning. But let me back into sort of the punchline. So first of all, a little bit, not about Illumio, but about cybersecurity. Obviously, everybody knows it's top of mind ever since the SolarWinds problem last December. Not that cyber wasn't big and visible before last December, but this ransomware sort of pandemic that we've lived with, Colonial Pipeline, obviously. If you had asked many of us that do this for a living, if you had asked us even a year ago, could we imagine a cyber event that would result in cars lined up at gas stations on the East Coast not able to get gas, we all would have said that sounds sort of crazy, possible, but silly. Now we've had that first one where a cyber attack led to a real world impact. So of course, now we're all asking the question, what else could go wrong? Cyber's been big and visible for a long time. There's a but on that comment though. And let's use this market conversation as a way to enunciate the but. Cyber is a fascinating category because it's huge, it's visible, it's super critical and important to the country, to citizens, to enterprise. Like, you couldn't have something that isn't higher up on the priority list in every boardroom. The President of the United States literally wrote an executive order a few months ago calling out the need for the country, for the federal government, for businesses to upgrade their cyber. You just don't get more visible and important than where cyber sits today. The but on that comment is it's about $150 billion spend this year, maybe $175 billion. And so anybody on my side of the table, especially somebody trying to start a company or go out and raise money, would say, well, I've got this enormous market. I mean, how many markets are out there that are $150 billion in TAM? Healthcare, there's a couple of others, but that's pretty up the list. The problem is that that's sort of a lie. It may not be a malicious lie, but it's still a lie. In order to really understand the market, you can't just say the total spend across the entire category is $150 billion, and therefore that's my market. Like most markets, the market is segmented. So think about the auto industry. The total spend on automobiles is an enormous number. But if you think about how those dollars really get spent, there's a part of the market down here. There's a big part of the market in the middle. There's a high-end part of the market. There's a super, super high-end part of the market. And the buyers and the dollars attached to those segments don't cross those lines often or easily. And so if you walk out and say, well, cyber's $150 billion TAM, therefore that's my market opportunity, you're probably lying to yourself and very often to the investors that you're asking to get behind your company. The right way to think about it is to look at it as a set of markets underneath an umbrella. The umbrella is a very, very large umbrella. the set of markets are varied in size. So for instance, in cybersecurity, there's a thing called the firewall, probably something that many people on this call have heard of, even if you know nothing about cybersecurity. The firewall is almost a $20 billion slice of that 150 billion. It's one of the biggest, most well-known slices within the overall market. So if you said, I'm going to build a better firewall and I'm going to go after the firewall market, you have a $20 billion TAM. That's a very big number to go after.
Sure.
So one of the things about cyber that a lot of people have been trying to figure out, and especially this past year as it's getting a lot more visibility, is where are those lines? How big are those slices? And what complicates cyber is that there are so many different pieces of the puzzle. So unlike the auto industry, where there's a low end, a big middle, a high end, a super high end, and generally you can draw 4 or 5 lines and carve it up fairly easily, cyber doesn't work that way. There are literally thousands of cybersecurity companies. There are hundreds of categories, some very large like firewall, some very, very niche, where it's a single product targeted at a single vertical or a single industry. And so the trick is to really understand when you start, what are you building? Who is it going to be applicable to? What industries or geographies or what part of the world is going to care about it or potentially adopt it? And who are you going to compete against? Because that'll also help you to understand your competitive landscape. Very often helps to define your market landscape. And so for Illumio, to bring it back to us, I sort of started with the punchline of, man, oh man, we got it dead wrong. When we started Illumio, we actually said, we're going after the firewall market. And so I assure you, I remember sitting at the tables on, in the conference rooms on Sand Hill Road out here in Northern California with all of those venture capitalists that people typically go to raise money. And I remember saying, we're building a better firewall. We had some slides to make it look a little prettier, but my argument started with, there's this, at the time, probably 12 or $15 billion TAM. And by the way, in TAM terms, if you've got $1 billion to go after, it's considered a reasonably good starting point. So if you've got 10 or 15 billion, that's an enormous TAM to go after as a startup. And I remember saying, we're building a better firewall. Yeah. Firewalls used to be built in hardware. Ours is going to be in software. Mark Andreessen has this very famous quote about software is eating the world. So even 8 or 9 years ago, it was sort of a timely way to describe it as, well, ours will be better because it's in software. And then we had an interesting sort of, I'll say, approach, because most security for the last 30 years has been about keeping bad things out. And our approach was not to try and build a better mousetrap to keep more bad things out. Our approach was to say sometimes bad things get in, and when they get in, we want to try and prevent them from spreading inside of the customer's environment. And that was sort of our novel value proposition. So some combination of, we're going to do it in software, and rather than focus on building brick walls around the outside to keep all the bad things from getting in, we're going to actually put our software on the inside, behind the brick wall. And if something happens to get over or get through, we'll stop it from running around inside and causing lots of harm. The reason why I said we got it dead wrong is because it turns out that everything I said about what our technology does, we got right. We did understand that part. What we didn't understand was the market. We didn't build a slightly better firewall. We didn't walk into customers and say, you spent $10 million on firewalls last year. This year, give us those dollars. We actually had built something that was a lot more different than we envisioned. And it turns out that after 8 years now, it seems to have found a place in the world, a new and different place. But it meant in those early days, we weren't going in and taking market or dollars from this big bucket. We were almost helping to sort of create a new bucket. And it took a long time to understand that. And it made life very, very complicated for our go-to-market for the first few years. And that's why I keep coming back to, the market is such an important part of understanding your story, not just your opportunity.
Yeah, it's really fantastic insight. And, when you think about total addressable market, it's more total addressable market segments. And it sounds to me that what you've articulated is that the cybersecurity space is this broad umbrella is one thing, but there are nuances within. and segments have different needs and have different outcomes that they desire. And it's really important that you understand how those outcomes differ and basically what business you're in. And I think I'd like to follow up a little bit on this point, because clearly you've experienced tremendous success. Most startups don't get to this point. And so when you think about identifying kind of how you started to how you've grown, can you share with the audience how you strike a balance as it relates to the core vision of your company? What I'll refer to this as kind of the execution environment. You know where you're at, you're prepared for scale, and you're off and you're running. But it sounds like there are often new opportunities that I'll call maybe the exploration stage, where you have a hunch that perhaps there might be a way to expand your business, but you have to vet that to see if it's a viable opportunity. How do you balance that? Not spreading yourself too thin and not trying to be everything to everybody, and really making sure that you're addressing those segments that you referred to that are really best fit for who you are as an organization.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, that's the right place to start. The answer is to say it is not easy. And there's a couple of things that sort of pop out. I'll give you a couple of anecdotes just so it's a little more tangible. But let me start by also framing sort of size and scale, because obviously I know we've talked about it. So we're a private company, but there are quite a few numbers floating around about sort of where we are as an organization. So at the end of this year, assuming we can fill our hiring plan, which hiring continues to be an incredible challenge, but we should be somewhere around 500 or so people globally at the end of this year. We're well over 400 today. We've raised a little less than $600 million in equity or investor financing now over about 8.5 years. The number in some sense seems staggeringly large to me, having raised it all. But in today's world, quite honestly, it's not vis-a-vis sort of what we see happening. And actually, until about 3 months ago, that number was about 2/3 of that, maybe a little bit more than half, because we just raised another $225 million a few months ago. So I think the total is now 585. But the number that tends to obviously be the one that we don't necessarily disclose our financials, but the one that most people focus on, and I promise you, for me, it's not how much money we've raised or how many people we've hired. We care deeply about all of that, but the one that we care about most is obviously our growth. And we don't disclose details, but we've said pretty openly that we'll be well north of $100 million of ARR, of annual recurring revenue, by the end of this calendar year, well north of it. And so that's the number that really talks to the size and scale of the business. We're a software company. We sell our product in a subscription model. So a customer signs a contract, and assuming that we do our job and do it well, hopefully they stay with us and renew, maybe even expand. And so that annual recurring revenue number tends to be our North Star, because it's really sort of the summation of all of our customer contracts. And breaking through 100 million is an important milestone for a company, especially one trying to sort of find its journey to being a public company one day. So all of that is sort of a way of saying that there's enough size and scale in the business that your question is right on, because it is complicated and it is at times very difficult. The trade-offs are hard. So I'll give you a couple of an anecdote and a couple of things that I think we've done. I'll say we've gotten better at doing well over time. So the first one was Morgan Stanley, ironically, was one of our first few customers. And we spent over a year with the team there. We were literally a garage startup coming out. We didn't have any revenue. We were talking to them even before we released the product. And one of the things that myself and my co-founder, our CTO, used to say to the early team, the company was probably, a dozen, 15, 20 people at this time. One of the things we used to say is, we're going to make sure that we don't let Morgan Stanley Morganize the product. This is sort of a term that you'll hear tech companies use, especially in their early days. They'll take that big customer and they'll stick IZE on the end of it, and they'll refer to it as Morganizing the product. In our case, it just happened to be Morgan Stanley. It could be Walmartizing the product if you want to pick a different one. The reason why we were so adamant about that was because, look, if you're a startup with no revenue and somebody like Walmart or Morgan Stanley or United Airlines or Salesforce shows up, and they say, we want to consider using your product, and if we do and it works and we scale it, it could be millions of dollars a year, there is very little that you're going to want to say no to. And what you'll find is that you will literally turn around 3 months, 6 months, a year later, and you will have become a custom software development shop for Morgan Stanley. Instead of looking at their feedback through the lens of, take all the things that they're saying, and if they're validated across other customers or even other customers like them, do it because it will be replicable, versus take everything they're saying as gospel because you want the big check and do it no matter what. And if it turns out half of it is only for them and never for anyone else, the temptation to go down that road is very powerful. So from the beginning, one of the things that I think we did get right was we said, we're not going to Morganize the product. And there were a few other customers that we stuck that IZE on the end of as well. And what we did was we looked at everything through the lens of, let's make sure that whatever we think is broadly applicable, we do, and we do well. But if it's truly a one-off, let's push back as hard as we can. And either they'll cave and we know we're right, or they won't, and then we can make the educated decision, is it worth doing this work knowing that it may be only for them? And I think on that front, we actually did a pretty good job. We won a lot of big banks early on. We found consistent themes through the banks, and we were able to say, okay, maybe this will be applicable for a customer like FedEx, one of our big customers today. Maybe it won't, but if we can win all the big banks in the world, that probably justifies the investment. We were very good about not letting something so specific to one customer get in the way. Here's what we weren't so good at. It happens in how you segment your market as well. So the company got very oriented around these very large customers. And the good news is that we won a lot of them. They spent a lot of money with us. They continue to today. They helped us to grow and achieve scale probably a lot faster than we otherwise would have. But there's a price you pay for that. The price we paid is we didn't do some of the things that make the product as easy as it needs to be to sell to the small to mid-sized market. And despite what anybody taught me in school or anything that I heard early in my career, it turns out that if you want to build a really large, really global, sustainable public company, you actually probably need to be good at both. And so it doesn't mean you have to be good at both on day one, but we got so pigeonholed into building for these large global companies that we sort of ignored the rest of the world. And the rest of the world's a big part of the world. And so that's an example of, we did really well on not letting one customer dominate, but we didn't do so hot at not letting one segment dominate. And now, as we're 8.5 years old and about 6 years in market, now we're doing all these things that I wish we had done a few years ago, and obviously doing them accelerated. We're fortunate to have the resources to step on a lot of gases at once, but trying to do a little bit of work to sort of catch up on things that I wish we had started earlier. And there's no perfect answer for this. You can't rewrite the history, but at the same time, you can learn from it. You can try and sort of prevent yourself from making the same mistakes again and again.
Yeah, that's such great insight. And I can tell you, without sharing too much detail, we made the same mistake in my second startup. And ironically, it was in fact JP Morgan. And so it is so easy to get caught in the trap that you just mentioned. So for anyone out there who is either working in a startup currently or have visions of starting one, this is a really, really important insight. And really, I would, if you haven't taken notes already, go back and watch the recording, because it's really something that can help you to not make the same mistakes others have in the past and learn from others. And, you know, Andrew, I think with that note, I wanted to transition to leadership. And one of the things I really I chuckled to myself a little bit after we met the first time. I said, he's just such a transparent person and just comes across as really authentic. And I wanted to kind of have that personal takeaway that I had about you as an individual. And I'd like to apply it more broadly to leadership, specifically leading through change. And everything that we just discussed a moment ago really helped to provide insight on how you manage evolution and change within your organization as you achieve success. But I would assume, and you just validated, that leading a hypergrowth late stage startup most certainly requires comfort with change. And I would assume that those circumstances you articulated are always evolving. And of course, one of the biggest changes for all of us, and hopefully the biggest change for all of us in our lifetimes, occurred last year in 2020, of course, with the circumstances surrounding COVID. And we were discussing the impact that that had on your organization. You'd shared a really interesting story with me about how you were forced to respond to those circumstances, and that those circumstances forced a new level of what you referred to as authenticity, and not just authenticity for you, but all business leaders. Can you elaborate on kind of what circumstances you were put in as it related to COVID, and a little bit of more on this idea of authenticity and how it guided your activities and actions as the leader of the organization.
Yeah, happy to. And obviously it goes without saying, the COVID story starts with an obvious comment, but one that I think sort of, sometimes gets sort of forgotten now because we've been in this for so long. Nobody had a playbook for this, right? No business leader, no political leader, nobody was sat down 2 or 3 years ago and said, we ought to run the tabletop exercise and figure out what do we do if you go home on Friday and on Saturday, the world starts shutting down, and on Sunday, everything shuts down, right? It was as real time as it gets. So 2 things. One, on the authenticity comment, because you're right, that's a word that I've been using a lot for a while now, and certainly COVID enunciated it. And I will share the story that I shared with you with the group. So look, leadership in 2021, and the same could be said of 2020, and this is not a COVID at all comment, leadership has become more complicated. I just want to share that for anybody in the audience that, by the way, this is not a CEO or a founder comment. You could be a manager of a team of 8. You could be a founder. You could be a CEO. You could be a CTO. You could be a head of product. Anybody leading a team, an organization, a group of people, the job has become a lot more complicated. It's stating the obvious, but we live in complicated times. There are obviously social issues and political issues that, quite frankly, never were in the workplace, that now are not only in the workplace, but are part of the workplace. And as a leader, you've got a responsibility and accountability to the business. That is actually the job that you sign up for. But the scope of that job has been dramatically expanded because of the world that we live in today. COVID was just yet another layer of that complication, and the one that none of us had ever prepared for. And so I had been working hard, and I've been talking to my team and my leadership team hard for a while now about this notion of authenticity. It's not my word, of course, but everybody talks about transparency. Transparency is simply how much you share. Authenticity is how much you speak your mind and how authentic you are in doing it. They're not the same thing. They certainly intersect and they're related, but they are not the same thing. You can be very transparent about the facts that you know. That does not mean that you're being authentic about how you feel about them. So COVID was the story that I think is worth sharing. So like most companies, last March, COVID hits. I literally will never forget it because it was a Friday afternoon. My chief people officer at the time called me, said to me, look, this thing's getting very real. We're hearing stories about what Salesforce and some of the other big companies in the area are doing. Some of them are even talking about shutting down. I know it sounds silly to say it that way, but that Friday, that's how the rumor mill was running. Saturday, spent most of the day on the phone with my team, with my board. They were on the phone with other CEOs, figuring out what they were saying. And then on Saturday night, Mark Benioff, the founder and CEO of Salesforce, announced we're going to shut everything down. And Mark is a very larger than life presence here in the Bay Area. Salesforce is a huge employer with 75,000 employees. When Mark says that and Salesforce says that, that's enough to drag along a huge part of the Bay Area. And others followed quickly, others meaning other large companies. By Sunday night, we had put the email out saying that we're not going to work on Monday. And that started a chain of events over the next sort of few weeks of what do we do? Is this going to be a problem? Do we need to lay people off? What is it going to do to the economy and to business? And those first sort of few months, we didn't realize what it was going to look like on the other side. So one of the stories that I've shared pretty openly is I had a lot of people, my board, my chief people officer, giving me advice. And one of the pieces of advice that I consistently received, and it makes sense, was you have to be very careful what you say. You could scare a lot of people depending on what you say. And for the first few days, I actually heeded that advice, right? I had employees, some of whom had been with us for a long time, that reached out to me directly, not executives, some of our sort of engineers who just knew me as Andrew, not as sort of CEO and founder. They've been with us since almost the beginning, and they reached out to me offline. Oh my gosh, what does this mean? And I sort of was very careful. And then we had our first all hands, where we got everybody on Zoom, obviously, because we couldn't do it in the building. And right before we got on, I made a decision that I was going to say exactly how I felt. Because look, we're all adults. We're all in this together. I have to be authentic and transparent. And I got on, and without telling anybody, including my executive team in advance, I said the following. I said, look, folks, I'm going through this just like you are. I have no playbook, just like you don't. We're all in this together. We're a team. We're going to sink. We're going to swim. We're going to do it together as we always do. This one's a lot scarier and a lot more unknown than a bug in the software, but we are going to do it as a team. So I'm going to tell you exactly how I'm going to think about this until we have more clarity. Priority number one for me as the CEO of the company is to make sure the company comes out of the other side of this alive. That's priority number one. Priority number two is to do that without ever having to lay anybody off for economic reasons, period. All stop. And priority number three is to keep the team that we have intact and not have to do anything dramatic around compensation like pay cuts in order to get us to survive. But I want to be clear. I will do number three. I will do number two if I believe that it will get us number one if necessary. And you can imagine a couple of weeks into COVID, that scared a lot of people. It also, over the next week or two, got everybody fully aligned on this company is going to come out of the other side of this thing no matter what. And it was a very interesting sort of thought process. In hindsight, I'm thrilled that I did it. At the time, I sort of figured it was either going to be an absolute epic moment or a complete disaster. And I was very 50-50 on which one. But in the end, I felt like I had to say what I really felt, which is, look, folks, I'm going to do everything I can to protect all of us, but I'm going to protect the company first because that's my job. And it turns out that fortunately, we never, ever touched comp. We never, ever laid a single person off. And the company obviously had a really good year last year, and this year is going to be a record year. But we didn't know that at the time, and I needed everybody to understand that that was what we were going to do. And I thought the authenticity was an important part of how we shared it. And so I think that there's a lesson in here for all of us about you got to be willing to say what's on your mind. You have to do it thoughtfully. It can't be erratic. It can't be not well thought out. I had spent weeks at that point really thinking about the words to use and why they were important, but they were authentic. And it really was how I felt at the time.
That's really great perspective. And you're right. And the reality is, in a leadership position, and like to your point, it can be in any leadership position. It doesn't have to be the CEO of a company. There are always going to be varying levels of transparency, right? That you can share or not share. And there are, from employee morale, there are a lot of factors that drive what you choose to share or not share. But I think the key takeaway is you have to make a decision on what's appropriate to share versus not based on the circumstances. But whatever that is, the key takeaway I just learned is that whatever you deliver, you need to be authentic in the way in which that you do it. And I know COVID's a really extreme example of what we all went through, but if I just think about my career, how many times in a leadership position, there have been moments where I don't have a playbook, right? And it doesn't always have to be as extreme as COVID, but there are varying levels of moments where you don't know. And I think that's a really great insight. And it's anyone, especially either in a startup environment or again, with aspirations of being in a startup environment, one of the biggest things you have to realize, there typically isn't a playbook because you don't know, you've never done it before. And so I think that insight is really helpful for anyone that are going to be in circumstances of extreme uncertainty, with very little data. And go ahead.
I totally agree with you. I was just going to jump in and say there's a favorite expression that a lot of us in startups have, which is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, obviously coined by somebody a lot smarter than all of us. And the funny part about it is that is sort of the startup environment. Like there is no playbook. You are even at our size and scale, we still feel like most days we're figuring it out. I tell people that we recruit all the time, you're coming here to build, not to run things. There is a huge difference in building something versus running it. Running it implies that it's built and it's running like a machine and you're just keeping it oiled. Building it means you're figuring it out. And so, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to screw up lots of things. The trick is to make sure that every one of them, you learn something, you do it a little better next time, but don't get too hung up on the playbook because you're not going to find it. And especially in things like COVID, there's nothing. So we're all making it up as we go and doing the best we can.
Yeah, no, that's really fantastic. And, Andrew, we have about 5 minutes left before we turn it over to Q&A. And we touched on this briefly, but, this last comment of being in a startup environment and oftentimes not having a lot of data and being in the build mode versus execute mode, we talk about the importance, especially here at Olin, of being both values-based and data-driven. So my last question for you is purposefully broad. But really everything we've talked about today, from market exploration and definition to solution building to leadership, does require both leadership, what I'll call values, as well as data. Do you have any guidance on how entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs should think about how they work to collect and leverage data successfully? Because everyone talks about it. We need to be data-driven. We need to be data-driven. But have you learned anything along the way as it relates to how to approach that? And this is a purposefully broad question to really give you the flexibility to take it wherever you'd like. But I think it's important for entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs to think about, how do you think about being data-driven in environments that often don't have a lot of the data that what I'll call established organizations do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to answer it fairly broadly as well, because I'm going to think about just our journey. And what I would say is, remember that there are 4 things that you're relying on, and there's some combination. The weighting is different in every situation. Your gut is a powerful tool. Don't ignore it. Yep. Your intellect is obviously there to be able to sort of help drive your analysis. Your experience is insanely valuable. That's going to make it sound like I'm weighting that the most. Sometimes I am, but it is insanely valuable. You don't realize the things you've done, and in particular, the mistakes you've made, how much you can actually lean on that. And then the 4th leg of the stool, if you want to think of it as a 4-legged stool, is data. And yeah, startups suffer from a problem, which is they don't have as much data as large, mature organizations. But number one, that doesn't mean there's no data. You could have 3 customers. You have the beginning of a data set as to why customers are buying your product. It's not rich, it's not deep, it's not high fidelity, but it's 3 more data points than 0. And so what I would say is, in our world, and it's different now than it was obviously 5 years ago, we do have a lot of data now. I still want more every day. But what I would say is, when somebody says be data-driven, don't let that be a substitute for your gut, your intellect, and your experience. Blend all 4 together. On the data front specifically, though, as a startup, as an early stage company, make sure that 2 things remain true. Make sure that the data you're collecting is important. There's a lot of times where you'll just start collecting data because you feel like you have to be data-driven because somebody said you must be data-driven. And it turns out the data you're collecting is worthless or garbage. And yet you sit there and spend all the time collecting it, even more time analyzing it, but it's the garbage in, garbage out theory, right? Not that the data itself is garbage, it's just not relevant to where you're trying to go. So make sure that the data you choose to collect, you're collecting for a reason. And then, of course, the second thing is, and this is the one that I promise you, at our size and scale, it's still very true. You have to be intellectually honest about what the data is telling you. That's where a lot of times emotion sort of conflicts with intellect. The data is telling you a story. It may be a story you like, it may be a story you don't like, but you have this incredible ability as a person to sort of bias the outcome based on what it is that you want to see. Don't let that happen. We had a particular story where we were collecting data. It was the right data. It was telling us the right thing, which was a bad answer. And we had a number of people, this was earlier in the company's life. I'm smiling because I think back on it now. And we had a number of people who found amazing ways to explain away this data, to explain away the conclusions, which was even more preposterous than explaining away the data. And let's just say that that went on longer than it should have. Fortunately, not long enough that it hurt or killed us. But now with hindsight, I look at it and say, we were not being intellectually honest with ourselves about what the data was telling us. So some version of combining those 4 things, but being intellectually honest and careful about the data, I think when you mix them up the right way, it's very powerful, even as a startup. And then as you get bigger and more mature, you'll have really smart people who know exactly what to collect. They've done it before. They'll know what engines or analysis to put on top of it. And the data will sort of scream the answer at you.
That's fantastic. And I mean, just, when you don't have data, not shying away from gut, experience, and intellect. And then as you when you're in a position to actually start to use data, understanding what to collect and actually listen to what it's telling you. I think that's a really great perspective. I always think about, the Sony Walkman, and the CEO of Sony was told not to do it. Don't do it. And that intellect, that experience, and that gut really paid off. And of course, made Sony who they are today.
Well, and only because you picked on the Walkman, there's an anecdote. I'm not testifying in any way whether it's true or not, but the story supposedly goes that people said at one point to Steve Jobs something along the lines of, why not build a better Walkman? And the answer was, if you ask a customer what they wanted, they would have said a better Walkman. Nobody had ever thought outside of the box to say, what if you could put a computer in your pocket that held 3,000 songs on it and didn't require cassette tapes? So there's all these little anecdotes about using your gut, intellect, and experience combined with data. And I that's the interplay that makes this all so interesting.
Yeah, no, and that's a perfect, we're right at 12:45, and I think that's a perfect transition to some questions. And a really interesting question here. We're going to just kind of go through some of these questions together. There was a question here, and the question is, with the increase in telehealth adoption, have you seen increases in cybersecurity issues? So being a new telehealth company based in Silicon Valley, this is an area of interest for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's obviously a slew, some fairly large ones. I know Teladoc got a lot of attention during the pandemic, obviously, not that they weren't before. There's a startup up in Seattle called 98.6 that's been trying to sort of attack the urgent care problem, sort of the base level healthcare problem from a telehealth perspective. So, we're fortunate to be partnered with some of the largest pharmaceutical and some of the largest health insurance companies and providers. So it is a space that we're in. I can tell you, I was literally yesterday or Monday, they all sort of blend together for all of us now. But in the last couple of days, I was on the phone or on Zoom with the CIO of one of the large hospital systems here in the United States, actually in the Midwest. Cyber has become about as top of mind in healthcare as anything. And actually, interestingly, it's when you think about the telehealth piece of it, you think about the data that's being collected, obviously, and protecting that. That's true of credit card numbers. It's true of Social Security numbers. If you actually take it even a step further, what the hospital systems and the actual providers that have these physical sort of premises, what they're terrified of is what's called the IT/OT problem. So many of us don't realize this, although if you visited a doctor's office or, hopefully not, but a hospital in the last couple of years, there is literally nothing left that isn't run on software, nothing. And if you happen to unfortunately have surgery, I assure you that's all run by software now too. The hospital systems are terrified of the potential impact of a cyber event that could actually get in the way of the operational technology that does things like run the operating room. So remember that what Colonial taught us all is that it's not just data and information. These things, these events, these breaches can have a real world impact. So for the telehealth provider, I'm sure they're concerned about the integrity of the data. They want to protect their customers' medical information. But I bet you anything, what they were a lot more worried about is what if we shut down the entire network and all of the patients got disconnected at once and we couldn't bring them back up online. So you have to think about it more broadly than just the data and the information. Most organizations are now thinking about this as, could you shut my business down? And that's the right way to be thinking about it, because that outcome's a lot worse than losing credit card numbers or even Social Security numbers.
That's great. And the next question is, it kind of goes back to our leadership discussion, I think, in a lot of ways. And the question is, as a CEO, how do you collect and utilize feedback from your employees to progress, both as an individual and as an organization?
So it changed a lot starting in March of last year. I always used to say this, that one of my favorite things to do, I traveled a lot before COVID, literally over 300,000 air miles the year before COVID. I was flying all over the world, meeting with customers, what we call channel partners, obviously our team in Asia and Europe. And then it just, it was a brick wall. It just stopped in March. I had never not been on the road, and all of a sudden it just ended. One of the things that I missed terribly about it was whether I was in the building in Sunnyvale, our headquarters, or I was in our offices in other places, it was that wandering around the hallway, having a cup of coffee with somebody. Hey, tell me what's going on. What's getting in the way of this deal? Not because of the deal or the dollars, but because you learned something and understanding it. And all of a sudden that all ended for me, just like it did for everybody else, right? Like I'm sitting here in my home in Northern California right now. I've basically been in this seat for 18 months. Zoom is incredible. But the reality is there are no more hallway conversations. If I want to find out what's happening on a deal in France, as I did early this morning, I got to set up a Zoom and I got to get on, and it's just not that interplay. So as a company, we did what a lot of companies did. We started doing huddles. So we used to have all hands, and we would have them in the building in Sunnyvale where more than half the company was located, and then we would bridge in everybody else. That ended. So we started doing everything on Zoom, but we did them much more frequently. We do surveys. We use survey tools, and we do surveys very regularly. How are you feeling? What do you need? What's going on? And run them. For a while, we were running them weekly. Now we tend to run them every 2 to 4 weeks, but we never did that before. And it's still not as good as the hallway conversation or the cup of coffee, but it allows us to get a lot of feedback on how the team is feeling, how the team is doing, what could we give them that would make them feel more supported during this period. And for me, I will tell you in all seriousness, I read every line of every piece of feedback that we collect. So last night, literally the last thing I did before shutting down was we ran what we call a pulse survey. We ran it over the last few days. The feedback gets aggregated up. So I'm not reading 420 individual survey results, but I am getting a lot of clarity on some questions that you may be surprised. How are you feeling? You know, is working from home better or worse this week than it was 2 weeks ago? Because we want to understand the mood and the morale of the team. And I'm spending a lot of time on that, and then reaching out to people who I know well within the company and saying, hey, give me 15 minutes and tell me what's going on. It's the only way to do it now. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, but you got to do it.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you've used technology to create the late great Tony Hsieh. I know I had a chance to meet with them in Las Vegas, and when they built their new headquarters, purposely shutting off areas where you could just walk in from the garage to other parts of the building to create what he referred to as collisions or serendipitous encounters that drive innovation. I can tell you, as a faculty member here at Olin, one of the biggest things I missed last year were those serendipitous encounters with students in particular. And so how you've been able to do that with technology is really fascinating. And, you know, I'm looking at the time here. We have a couple minutes before we'll turn it over to Carrie. But so I wanted to kind of maybe go to a broad, there are some really great questions in here. But I wanted to close maybe with this question from Sarah, who asked, is there anything you would do differently if you could do it all over again?
Yeah, the only problem is we need to keep the Zoom going for the next 3 days to get through the first 2% of the list. And everybody's going to think I'm kidding when I say that, but I'm not. I mean, yes, hindsight is truly 2020, right? So, I mean, there really is a long list. I'll try and give a thoughtful, but also a little more concrete answer besides the fact that we need 3 days to cover the first 2%. You know, there's probably two things that pop to the top of mind. The first one is this conversation that we had around market. And I was open about it because it is absolutely a failure. Fortunately, not a critical and not a fatal one, but it's a failure. We didn't do what was necessary. We did what a lot of people, especially a lot of technology people do, which is we massively over-rotated on being excited about our idea without understanding the world that we were entering and where it would fit in. And it cost us. Now, at the end of the day, when you start a company, for those of you out there that are considering it, the game that you're playing is the longest of long games you'll ever play. Every mistake you make along the way is an opportunity. It's corny, it's cheesy to say it that way, but it's true. The only one that isn't is the one that kills you. That's the reality. So it's hard to look back with regret. And that's the one thing I would say is I don't regret all these things, but I also don't excuse them, and I don't write them off, and I don't forget about them. One thing without a doubt that I would rewind the tape on would have been that market analysis. We didn't do enough of it. The other one, a little more personal, and again, to make it a little more concrete, the best way I ever had it explained to me is I was with one of my mentors who is the CEO of a very large public company, $100+ billion market cap. He's still a mentor and a friend today. And he said to me, there are sort of two forms of founders, typically, especially out here in Silicon Valley, but the comment was more generic. One is you sort of look at their CV and they did all the right things. They went to the right school. They had the right first job. They had the right second and third job. They learned a lot in the right places. And then they aggregated it all up and they used it to start something. And then there is the other sort of group of founders where you literally scratch your head and wonder how they made it out of bagging groceries in a grocery store, let alone start a company. Those are his words, not mine. But he was trying to juxtapose sort of the difference. I definitely fit more in category 2 than category 1. I'm proud of it. It is what it is. It's sort of like playing the long game. It doesn't really matter how you get there so long as you do. But in hindsight, in a very personal moment, I would say, I should have been more deliberate about some of the choices I made before Illumio. They would have served me better. I ended up learning a lot through some of the crazy decisions I made, but hindsight is 2020 for a reason. And, you know, the one thing I wouldn't change is I wouldn't change WashU. And I'm not just saying that because it literally started the path that I'm on today. I've said that very openly, but there were some things between WashU and Illumio that I look back on and say, I should have been more thoughtful and deliberate about them. And so I can't rewrite the script, and I wouldn't even if I could, but I would tell you all, just think about the decisions you're making and why you're making them, and then make them. And if they work, great. And if they don't, learn from them. It's all good, but at least be thoughtful about them. It's an important lesson, and it does help along the way.
That's such a perfect way to end. And Andrew, I want to thank you not only for your time, but also, of course, your insight, your perspective, and really just all you do for Olin. You know, your involvement in giving back to the school, which helps to give back to the students and the community that surrounds us. It's really, really helpful. You're actively involved in helping work with the Scandalera Center. So you just give a lot of time, and just want to thank you for that time and that insight and that perspective. I know I learned a lot this afternoon, which I'm going to be able to take with me and honestly put back into the classroom, which is fantastic. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, who will help to kind of take us to the next step in the event. So Carrie, are you there?
Hi. Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Carrie, can I just say one last thing? I just want to say thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure to do it. I'm definitely going to try and get on campus as soon as you guys will let me on. And my email address was up there. It's andrew@illumio.com. I always say it. Anybody who's got any questions or just wants to chat, please feel free to shoot me an email and reach out. I'm happy to do it. But thank you again.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Carrie Donnelly with WashU Olin's graduate admissions team. I'd like to offer another thank you to Andrew and Michael for their insights today on entrepreneurship in the tech space, data-driven strategy, and managing change. The discussion today gets to the core of all of Olin's graduate programs. Our highly ranked full-time MBA focuses on values-based, data-driven leadership and prepares students to lead in a global changing world, providing insight on the ways culture and values impact business. With a 6-week, 3-continent immersion to kick off the program, this full-time program develops leaders who want to confront global challenges to create change. The application for our 2022 full-time MBA opened last week. Our first round application deadline is coming up on October 19th. Our team would love to connect and see if this program can help you with your career goals. You can learn more at the short URL on your screen now, and we are also sharing a link in the chat. If you have questions, you can reach out via email, phone, or request information form. I also want to mention that we are excited to announce our new online MBA. This part-time program is 100% online and was designed for working professionals who aim to use digital technology as business strategy. Our online MBA is grounded in the same core principles as our other MBA programs. Courses address current, real-world skills and strategies through the lens of technology driving business today. Things like AI, machine learning, and the Internet of Things. The inaugural class is currently forming and will start in January 2022. You can learn more about this program at next week's virtual information session on Tuesday, October 5th. You can register using the short URL on your screen now, and we're also sharing a link in the chat. In closing, thank you once again for attending today's Leadership Perspectives. Please join us for our next event on Tuesday, October 26th at noon, where we will hear Olin alumna Megan Barry, founder and CEO of By Reveal, and Olin professor Doug Villard discuss the entrepreneurship process, venture capital investing, and how digital transformation is changing every sector of business. Watch your email for the invite, and we hope to see you there. Until then, we wish you well. Have a wonderful afternoon.